And so I don't forget to do it. Thanks to all of you for being here. Regardless of the level of concern, regardless of the amount of effort made to let people know about sessions like this, nothing controls it more than the weather. Nothing controls attendance. And so I looked out the window this morning, my heart sank. We're going to be talking to ourselves, and you guys came and you filled the room, so thank you. Okay, a few questions I guess have been offered. Amy Klinkhammer, do you want to add a few things about the Finger Lakes Hub before you start? You're welcome to. Or?
Yeah, sure. Is this on? Can everyone hear me okay? So I'm Amy Klinkhammer. I'm the coordinator, the watershed coordinator for the new Finger Lakes Hub, which is housed at our DEC office in Syracuse, but we work in Region 7 and Region 8, which is the Rochester area, because those are the two regions for the Finger Lakes. So this hub, we call it a hub because it is working throughout both regions. So we work closely with Region 7, Region 8, and then our central office, which Scott is out of in Albany. So I was actually the first person hired. We have a new research scientist starting on Monday. We have an additional research scientist we're hiring shortly. And then we'll actually hire a senior level research scientist to kind of oversee all of the hub's activities. We're definitely still getting our feet under us, and definitely myself. So I've met quite a few of you in the room and up here, but we're still kind of getting a sense of what our priorities are, and obviously the HABs in Owasco Lake is our priority. So although we're focusing on the entire Finger Lakes region, Owasco and Cayuga are actually our focuses, at least in the beginning. So I don't want to take up too much time because, as you can see, I have a ton of questions that I know we're not going to all get through, but hopefully you saw most of people's contact information. I have a few cards as well, so if you have any questions, I can definitely help you out in getting you connected with the right person. So we're definitely not going to get to all these questions, but I'll just get started. So the first question is kind of a very broad question, and I don't know if we just want to kind of go down the row here to start with, but what public policy changes do you recommend to reduce the cyanobacteria, their blooms, and the release of toxins? With the understanding, obviously, you're not going to answer this question, or else we probably wouldn't be here today. But just to kind of set the stage for talking. Seth, do you want to start?
That's a tough one, and I remember I was warned about this question. I completely forgot about it. So, and I have to go first. I was just talking to John. He has a nice written, prepared response for this. So, with respect to that, and in our last watershed management agency meeting, Dr. Liz Moran put up a percentage based on non-point source runoff and measured that effectiveness of lowering phosphorus in the lake. Much like we do with respect to green energy and set goals for ourselves, I think that the state should take the initiative to set some sort of a percentage reduction of non-point source runoff and be prepared to fund or offer incentives to the contributors of non-point source runoff. That's one thought.
Yeah, I'm John Strapelli. I'm with the State Health Department out of the Syracuse Regional Office, and the one policy change I would propose is updating the watershed rules and regulations. I know the Cayuga County Health Department is going to pursue that activity, and we definitely would support that as a state health department, and there's a desire to do that and move forward, and I think that's a good idea. However, one has to recognize this process will take years to do. It's not something that happens overnight. But the watershed rules and regulations, coupled with public education, really do help to unify community and by defining the geographic area of concern. And I think you folks have already done that today by talking about all the different things that are going on. But we saw this also in the Skaneateles Lake watershed. When you educate the public, then they realize how important it is to protect the Owasco Lake watershed, and also because it's in the entire community's best interests to do so. And when the public buys into watershed protection, then they can also act as stewards by considering their own actions, which I heard also spoken about, and also to report violations. They're kind of the eyes and ears out there, if you will. And by reporting those violations, then the local officials that are in charge can actually, pursue enforcement action if possible, depending on the nature of violation. It could be DEC, it could be the Cuyahoga County Health Department, or both, or the watershed inspection program, which exists out there. So we definitely support that. And I did hear talk about septic systems. This county does have a very robust program. There are many counties out there that have no program. So you're fortunate in that regard.
Bruce Natalie from County Planning. A little surprised I'm up here, but I would just like to emphasize whether it's HABs or blue-green algae or nearly any issue, everybody needs to do their best on what they control. So if you're a lakefront, if you're Lakeview, if you're a farmer, if you're a boater, everybody needs to do their part. The boaters introduced that whole realm of invasive species, but we also have these whole bunch of other issues that eventually could negatively impact the lake. What's going to happen to our hemlock trees and our ash trees as the hemlock woolly adelgid and the emerald ash borer start taking hold of the hills above the flats in the lake could just be devastating. So we gotta not only fix our current problems, we gotta get beyond those. So having a goal for knocking down non-point and incentives would be very good, because we actually have to clean this thing up so far so that when the dying hemlock trees start adding even more sediment. I hate to be pessimistic on this, but what the woolly adelgid and ash borers are going to do to the watershed in 5 to 20 years is potentially worse than some of the things we've already seen. So we got to be prepared now and everybody has to do everything they can to reduce their impact on the lake, to preserve it for your kids and your grandkids.
One area that Al is very interested in trying to implement and recommend is the water quality monitoring from all around the watershed. There are, in the agricultural community, they have certified nutrient management plans, and there's basic best management practices, and they are implemented, but there's not, as far as we know, any monitoring of their actual effectiveness or adequate data demonstrating that, what works and what doesn't work. And so we think downstream from all kinds of areas in the lake and the watershed, the water quality needs to be monitored and to see what the issue is. It relates back to what Seth talked about, non-point sources. And the other issue I wanted to emphasize was what I mentioned earlier about and it was been mentioned that about septic systems and inspections, that needs to be done statewide. I'm sure there's many, like John said, there's other counties and other lakes that do not have this effective septic system inspection program. So that needs to be done, required from all counties.
One of the problems being the fifth person in the line is that it's easy to just say what they said, because there's an awful lot of good ideas that were already brought out. But a couple of key points that I think are worth re-emphasizing. I heard collaboration, and I think that's, and the parallel to that of everyone doing their part, I think is critically important, is that there is no single answer to what we're seeing here. There's a lot more work that needs to be done. And in terms of very specific policy changes, to some extent it may be premature to go full-blown in directing a lot of very new initiatives without a lot of additional answers in front of us. We still need to collect a lot more information, but we need to identify what things can be done now, and a lot of the work that was already talked about here, a lot of the work that Rick talked about in his presentation, what's going on in the watershed. A lot of that work and the state funding of a lot of those activities will continue to be part of this process. The renewed effort, hiring a Finger Lakes hub, recognizing the problem and trying to respond to that, I think is a step in the right direction. So again, collaboration, everyone playing a role in that process and trying to identify the things that we can do now, let's do them. The things that we need more information to gather before we can do them, let's continue the process of gathering that information so the science can continue to catch up to all the management actions that are already going on.
We ask a lot from our lakes. We want to live on them. We want to boat on them, fish on them, hunt on them. They are vessels for our waste, and occasionally they have problems. And so today we have this cyanobacteria crisis on Owasco Lake. And from someone that does science, it's always a little frustrating to get the question, well, how are we going to fix it? And it's frustrating because we don't invest in monitoring over the long term. So there are fundamental things about Owasco Lake and our other lakes that we don't know. We don't know much about loading of phosphorus to the lake. Where are the biggest loads coming from? Are they ag? Are they septic? We may have educated guesses, and not all phosphorus is the same. Stream bank erosion is mostly phosphorus that's tightly bound to particles. It's not available to algae. Phosphorus that's soluble from, say, manure or septic systems is very different. That can be directly used by algae. So, I think in the big picture, we need to invest in long-term monitoring efforts so that we're in a better position to address crises when they happen rather than being solely responsive, because it puts us in an awkward position, in a place where we can't address things as rapidly as we should be able to.
Good answers. So one thing that probably hasn't been touched on, otherwise, I mean, I would have said everything that they said up to now. The one thing that's probably missing to all this is, where's the money coming from? So as from a policy standpoint, what you might start considering, either at the town level, the county level, or anybody who uses the watershed level, think about ways that you might have everybody share the cost in trying to keep this lake the way you want it to remain, or maybe even slightly improve it in the years to come. Thanks.
So as you can see, we received a lot of really great questions. So I'm going to try to summarize some of them into broader questions because, we don't have a ton of time left. I got a lot of very specific questions on both John and Dave, your research. So to kind of broaden it a little bit, I know you brought up a lot of questions that we still don't have answers to. Can you, and Scott, perhaps you can also chime in, and anybody else, can you kind of identify what you see are the biggest data gaps? We heard the ratio of phosphorus and nitrogen. We heard potential sources. We heard that Owasco Lake has lower phosphorus levels than what you would see in, other lakes that are, having these blooms. Can you identify the biggest data gaps and where you would like, if you had $5 million, if money wasn't an issue, the type of data that you would try to collect?
We all looked at each other and said, do you want it? So I'll start. I thought among the many interesting things that we've talked about today, in part of Dave's presentation, he talked about the initial findings about the birth of the blooms, if you will, that they seem to be concentrating first in the open water and then moving to the shoreline and building up along the shoreline. So in a lake that has low phosphorus and overall algae levels, we're getting this buildup along the shoreline. There are lots and lots of lakes in New York State that have low phosphorus and algae levels that aren't getting this buildup and aren't getting high toxicity associated with those. Why is that occurring on Owasco Lake? What is unique about this lake? Or perhaps from a New York State perspective, which is what I have to spend a lot of my time thinking about, not just Owasco Lake, is this going to happen in other lakes? Is Owasco the first one out of the chute? And is that changes in food web interactions? Is that something to do with nutrient ratios or soluble versus insoluble forms? As it has something to do with the unique physical layout of this lake? I think those are really important limnological questions, the study of this lake, but I think those are really important management-related questions, because ultimately what we need to do with all of this research, all of this why, is to build management programs around that, to try to say this is why not anymore, why this is not happening anymore. So what are the things that we can manage in this system that are directly related to the blooms and are worth the effort, the manpower, the cost, the time to implement them? There's a lot of interesting work that will come out of the work that Dave and John and others are doing. And I think this is, and I'm sorry, I'll speak from a limnology perspective, a really exciting opportunity to learn this, but I recognize we need to get to answers really soon. So I think that there's a lot of good work that's already going on, and I think there's a lot more that should be coming soon.
In the short term, the only tool in our toolbox that's been demonstrated to have an effect on eutrophication in general and cyanobacteria levels specifically is reducing phosphorus inputs. There are a lot of other ideas. That is the only one I'm aware of that's been demonstrated to work. Given that, we need to reduce phosphorus loads, but it needs to be done efficiently and wisely. We need to focus on the forms that, that the algae can use. That was done in the Cayuga Lake watershed in support of that TMDL. I think a similar effort should be done on Owasco Lake to help guide the projects that are going to be done in the watershed.
Dang, never be last, especially after some really good answers like this one. From my perspective, I don't really see significant blue-green algae problems way out in the middle of the lake. Therefore, going into the nearshore region, for me, would be the next logical thing to do. What's different about that nearshore region compared to offshore that really promotes what's going on? And it's going to take significantly more effort, in my opinion, than perhaps putting a few buoys there, looking for a few zebra and mussels and a few other things along those lines. So the more effort that can be put in that near shore, then perhaps we can tackle where the problem is right now, which is in the near shore zone.
Good answers. On a similar note, there was many questions that asked about the relationship of climate change and how, we've already observed our climate changing and how that could potentially impact the drinking water, recreation, the increase in the amount of HABs with increase in temperature. So, I don't know if, Seth, you want to take that from your perspective or if we want to kick it back to the researchers for your perspective. I'll leave it up to you.
Matt Marco and I were just discussing climate change and how that didn't come up during the presentations. And we observed that in November of 2016, climate change no longer is an issue, right? So, so that's my, no. As a municipality and a critical infrastructure component to what I do, that's very important to the city of Auburn, and something that I spoke to a little bit in our presentation with respect to redundancy and coordinating with other municipalities like Aqua and other local water providers. That's right on the tip of the tongue in many technical conferences that you go to now is climate change and how to be able to adapt. Ken Lynch, the past regional director of the DEC, once mentioned at a conference that, when he first started, they were measuring in parts per million. Now we're talking parts per billion and parts per trillion. So there's challenges there too, with respect to being able to keep up with the technology and be able to measure these contaminants down to that measurable level. So certainly climate change has brought about a lot of new challenges, and we're learning more and more every day. And not only is it climate change, but it's just us getting smarter as a community and understanding the interrelationships of chemicals and what they can do to the human body or to other organisms in our environment. So.
I guess we're all speaking. The health department is very cognizant of climate change, and we're trying to also adapt and respond to protect public health. It's getting tougher and tougher, though. There's more and more stuff going on. We see more and more beach closures. We've had more harmful algal blooms than I've ever seen, and especially in the last few years. And Scott Kispa's emails keep coming. I mean, hundreds of them. This year, we were even joking that we saw frozen. We had HABs, and now we have FABs, frozen algal blooms. We actually saw algae blooming under the ice, which I've never seen before, and it was microcystin. So we're trying to get the messaging out there to protect public health. We don't just do drinking water, we do recreational water. There's other issues too with the heat that changes how the drinking water supplies are behaving. Different parameters change, disinfection byproducts are going up because the water gets warmer. So there's a whole bunch of different things that's very complicated, and we're trying to adapt as we go along. Climate, we're trying to get people the word out for cooling centers. I mean, I could go on and on. So the health department is very cognizant of climate change and doing the best we can to adapt and try to get the message out to protect public health.
I'll just add a couple of notes to that, and I agree with everything that John said, that this is increasingly becoming an agency's concern, and that we need to continue to build resiliency programs, response programs around this. But a couple of unique challenges to this particular issue. Climate change brings longer growing seasons, which extends the period of time, as John pointed out, both from recreational users' perspective, but the time frame in which the potential exposure to these blooms becomes important. Work that Chris Gobler, Professor at SUNY Stony Brook, has been doing over a number of years finds that there are specific cyanobacteria taxa that are selected for with higher temperatures, that you get more growth of microcystis, ergonosus specifically, and other species that we're concerned about at the expense of other things. And then that the effect that climate change is going to be having on weather patterns generally, and the formation of storms and the intensity of storms followed by longer dry periods is just a recipe for this problem getting much worse. I'll just add one other note, is that as I think John and Dave both alluded to, an awful lot of what we've learned about limnology and its effects on things like cyanobacteria has come from a long-standing body of literature that talks about the connection between nutrients and algae. That work is upended by a new environment in which we're having to contend with. So a lot of the information that we built our response programs around might not be as accurate as it used to be, and we need to adapt to that as well.
Just a quick anecdote. I recently completed a study with some colleagues over in Europe, and what we wanted to do was look at lakes that have had major nutrient reductions over the long term, and look at cyanobacteria populations in those lakes. And what we found was that if you reduce total phosphorus levels to about 40 or 50 micrograms per liter, you didn't have problems with cyanobacteria. Clearly, that's not the case anymore, and that could very well be a result of climate change or interactions between climate change and invasive species such as quagga and zebra mussels.
You guys
I also received a lot of very specific questions for you, Seth, relating to the water filtration. But I encourage, there was many of them, and I wouldn't be able to go through all of them, but I encourage you to attend the city council session on March 9th.
March 9th, yep, 6 PM.
But there was many questions kind of broadly related to DEC and DOH, both state DOH and local DOH's role in ensuring safe drinking water for obviously the city residents and the town of Owasco residents. So I was wondering if maybe DOH and DEC, and Seth, you feel free to jump in. Can you talk about your role and kind of maybe what happened last summer and how, what your plan is moving forward to ensure clean drinking water?
Yeah, I can speak to that. I was very intimately involved with this whole issue. It started in September and it went through November. I was backing up, we were monitoring the lake before it happened, and then we saw it coming. And basically, when the detection in the finished drinking water occurred, everybody kind of flipped out because it never had happened before. But we were prepared for it. We had the public notification language, and we had talked to the folks in Albany about the health advisories and stuff. But the plan is to basically do the same thing again this year, to monitor the situation like we did last year. And I mean, I was on the phone every day with Cuyahoga County Health Department staff, literally texting, emails, more than every day. People asked about, well, why can't we get sample results sooner? Well, to do the analytical takes about 4 to 5 hours. This year, the state actually committed resources, and they'll be able to shorten the analytical down by 30 minutes. But the biggest thing is we can run way more samples than we did last year. Last year, we had to be very judicious about how many samples we collected. And it's also quite an undertaking. Once you collect a sample, it takes 3 to 4 hours to get it to Wadsworth Labs in Albany, and then it takes 4 to 5 more hours to do the analytical. So, you're looking, with less than 12 hours, you can have sample results from samples that were collected that day. And that's what we were doing last fall. I mean, that was occurring for day after day after day. And sometimes we'd collect samples in the morning and in the evening on the same day, and they would be run the following day. But it was a lot of work and a lot of effort on the Cuyahoga County Health Department staff. Were on it every day. And Eileen O'Connor's folks were wonderful. Everything we asked, they did. And they collected the samples. They issued the public notification. Our goal is to protect public health. The health advisory language that was used was developed by EPA. You've seen that number 0.3. 0.3 is kind of the magic number, but in reality, that's a 10-day standard to protect the most sensitive populations like bottle-fed infants or very frail folks. So the health department has said, no, we're going to use that as the number. If it's 0.3, we're going to issue some type of a notification. We're not going to let it persist for 10 days. So we've taken a more conservative approach in this state until we have better information. And I could go on and on, but I won't. So
I guess I'll just add, since Amy suggested DEC response as well, that while the drinking water program is under the authority of the health department, there are a number of things the DEC is doing, much of which we've already talked about already, to help support, I think Amy's term was assure clean water. One of which, as I mentioned, is this shoreline harmful algal bloom surveillance program, which really is the early warning system for when we're seeing it in the open water. So we're going to continue to support that work, working with Tim and many of the other local partners, so that we can give John and Eileen and their staff enough early warning as possible that a bloom may be an issue for drinking water use. A lot of the other watershed management activities that we're talking about, funding activities, a lot of the work of the Finger Lakes Hub is the acknowledgement that drinking water is a critically important issue in the Finger Lakes region, and DEC will continue to work with the health department to try to assure safe drinking water as often and as frequently and as inexpensively as possible.
What do you say, one more question? I know we're a little over on time, but there was a few questions related to different hotlines set up. So whether to report a potential source of contamination, whether to report a potential bloom, and various other, and there's not, unfortunately, to my knowledge, there's not one hotline where you can report all of these things, but can you, maybe Scott, you can at least talk about the HAB and how you report seeing a HAB and who you can call. And then I'm not sure who the best person to talk about, maybe the watershed inspection program and how you can report potential contaminations through that, but.
Well, both of those questions are probably going to go back to the watershed inspection program, because again, we have this collaborative arrangement with Tim Schneider and the county health department and others that whenever there is a public observance of a bloom, we ask you to report it to Tim at the watershed inspection program or Eileen at the county health department. You can always report it to DEC, 518 can't remember my own number. 402-8179 is the harmful algal bloom hotline number. There's also habsinfo@dec.ny.gov in which you can provide any report, but we encourage you for the purposes of expediting a response to first contact Tim and or Eileen from the county health department, and Tim can provide the best contact information.
Thank you. So sorry we didn't get to everybody's questions. This is more meant to be the start of a conversation, the continued conversation. And thank you once again to all the panel members and the presenters. Can we give them a round of applause? Thanks, Bob.
And thank you also to all of you for being here and being part of this.
Yeah, really interesting.
Travel safely.